Michelle. What's up?
Well, I heard we're going to talk about Dubya, George W. Bush today. Is that right?
It's time. It's
Okay,
time.
it's way time.
I think this has been the episode we've been building up to for a bit. But again, it's another,
time.
it's like so much of it is like shrouded in mystery, but I'm ready.
True.
I'm ready and I'm excited.
Yes, me too. I've spent so much time with this family. I'm like, oh, don't invite me to the reunion. Like, I don't want to go.
I mean, honestly, though, like, I think George Bush's daughters, I would definitely party with them. Even though they're probably evil, I kind of like mean girls, you know?
Right, Jenna and Laura. Right.
Yes.
I remember, since we brought them up, I have to say this. I remember my housemate back when he was in office, and I almost said in prison, which might be kind of the truth. But
That's funny.
She and I used to read the newspaper together in the morning, and I remember her losing her mind because Jenna Bush was back in rehab, or she'd been caught in rehab with a small amount of crack cocaine. And at first, when my housemate, she was fuming about this. She's like, she got caught with a small amount of crack cocaine. I was like, I don't get it. What are you like so mad about? And she said, well, you think if I got caught with crack in rehab, they'd bother to tell you it was a small amount?
Right.
So,
right.
Right. So
just
anyway.
A little bit. Just a little sampler of crack.
Barely crack at all. It was just
a little bit.
She's trying, so that always comes.
Yeah, no, I would definitely party with her.
Crack.
Yes, I would party with her. Yes. She sounds wild cards. I mean, her family is a bunch of wild cards. But then at this point, when you're getting to like celebrity culture and like, you know, the millennium turning over. Okay, I don't want to digress and just go on a tangent. I've made my point.
Well, yes. So, good old George W. Bush. So he is the son. He is the oldest child and oldest son of George Herbert Walker Bush, Poppy, and Barbara Bush, whom we have talked about quite a bit. Poppy is such a prolific politician that we can't stop talking about him in this presidency either, of course. But Dubya, as he is called, and as we will call him throughout this episode, was the oldest. And then they had quite a few kids. They had Robin, Jeb, Neil, Marvin, and Dorothy. So you don't hear a lot about, you hear about Jeb. Robin died very young. Yeah, it's an interesting part of W's story, and an interesting part of the Bush family saga is she had an incurable disease. I believe it was leukemia, and they had been trying to treat her, you know, of course. And at one point, Poppy and Barbara realized that Robin's gonna die. And at the time, Dubya is 7, and they want to make this last-ditch effort to try to save their daughter, of course. But they realize that she's probably going to die, and they leave. And they tell Dubya they leave Midland, Texas, and they fly to someplace in Massachusetts for the medical attention. And they tell Dubya it's fine, we'll be back. Everything's going to be fine. She's going to be fine, right? And then she dies in Massachusetts, and they bury her there and have the funeral service and all of it. This gives me chills because they show back up in Midland, Texas, and Dubya even recalls, he's like, I could swear I saw Robin in the back seat. And then they had to get out and tell him that she was gone. So,
oh my God, George W. Bush, Ghost Whisperer.
Yeah, right. I know, right? He's like, I could swear I saw her in the back seat. It's like,
she followed them back.
Yeah, and so, and as you know, the story goes, I mean, they were close. Like he was close to Robin. So that is, and then Barbara later on says, I still struggle if we made the right decision, with little W or whatever. We thought we were doing what was best
by leaving him in Texas and not bringing him.
Yeah,
wow, this is so weird. Rich people are fucking freaks.
Rich people are freaks, and it's the 1950s. I think that, like, we've come across, like, enough child psychology now that we're like, no, Barbara, you fucked up. Right? But I don't know at the time. But also, yeah, I think rich people are weird. Or, and then maybe there's just some, like, of them, like, believing, no, we're so rich, we can get anything we want. Like, it doesn't, our kids don't die, or whatever. Who knows? You'd have to tell yourself a miracle's coming, I would think. But at any rate, it plays into W's story, I think, in a big way. Because I think it plays into some of his lack of motivation in one way towards things, which we see over and over. I mean, what we see over and over from W. I mean, he becomes one of the most powerful people in the world, of course. But I mean, for anybody besides the Bush to show as much lack of interest and motivation as W showed, you would fail at all of life.
Oh my God.
Right?
The most privileged, the most white privilege. Yes. Like, you don't even want to be. You're like, well, I had to become president. My dad made me.
Basically. Yeah, basically. So we don't, and I never hear anything about Dorothy. She's the youngest. I don't know anything about her. She never comes up. The other sons do. Jeb, Neil, and Marvin do come up, and they do figure into some of the things that go on. So he's destined, like we just said, he's destined to fulfill this legacy. And so, of course, there are things that have to happen. He has to go to Yale, which he does. And he was Skull and Bones, just like Poppy had been, just like Prescott had been. So that's a big part of the family legacy. And it's a big, we talked about this in other episodes. The Skull and Bones, probably at one time at least, really was an occultist club. I mean, they say that Prescott stole Geronimo's skull, and Geronimo's family still says, they have
fucked
it.
Up.
It's so fucked up. So I do think that probably at one time Skull and Bones was pretty dark. One of the things that I know that you did when you joined Skull and Bones is you would tell them, it's kind of like Scientology a little bit. Like, you would tell them, like, your darkest secrets, especially, like, your sexual secrets. And so they kind of, like, so they kind of have you on that, So it's like for the rest of your life, it's like, we'll tell them what you did to that cow, or whatever.
No, not the cow!
Like, no, I'm making that up. I'm just saying, for, like, they kind of have you on that, right? So he did that, and then, of course, after Yale, and, I think it's well established, people, like, it's been said throughout the media that, he was, because we always call W stupid, which I don't I think he lacked motivation. I don't think he was stupid. But as somebody, right. So as someone had said, they're like, well, he made C's at Yale, and somebody else said, yeah, it's still Yale. So, to just also, right. So to keep in mind that not only does Yale have a higher grading scale than regular schools, like Ivy League schools have a higher grading scale. So making a C at Yale is a little bit more like making a B somewhere else, and plus things are quite a bit harder than they would be at a state school. So I just want to put that out there. Making a C at Yale, you could do worse. Okay.
I guess I will say though, like, I feel like knowing how colleges like cheat grades for athletes and sports stars and stuff, like, he could have just been paying them off. But it doesn't mean that he's not, smart. Like,
right, exactly. And I don't even know if those are unsubstantiated rumors there anyway. He could have very well have just been like, he's a Bush, he gets A's,
Yeah,
I mean,
but also, like, what's the
right.
point of people trying to, like, assert that he's not smart unless it was to, like,
right.
alleviate, like, him having responsibility for his actions, which he definitely does.
Right. No, I mean, that's really true. And I even think that, it's a little bit of a ruse to his very charming man, and people leave that off. They want to talk about him being stupid more than they want to talk about the fact that he was very charming and could really get his way just kind of by flashing a smile and, kind of talking his talk. One, and two, and I think this is also an important part of the Bush family story, is Poppy and Barbara, they're like New Englanders from, up in the New England coast, right? That's their deal, which is where Yale is, right? So they come from that background. But Dubya actually is raised in Midland, Texas. And so his, he does have, right? So he does have this fairly natural, I think, probably Texas accent, at least to some degree. I mean, if they didn't speak it in the home, he certainly was around it in his community and picked it up there. And so there's also this bit of, I think unconsciously people don't realize that you're also just calling the Southerner in the family stupid.
That's true. People love doing that.
People love doing that, But also I want to take back, there's been a charge that he was kind of a fake Texan, but not really. Yes, the family they did move to Texas for very specific reasons having to do with business and politics, and they did want to make themselves kind of more American in a, like more everyman type style. So Texas has, an oil, and there's many reasons that the family moved to Texas, but the children were all raised in Midland, Texas. So, all right. So the next thing that he needs to do after Yale is he needs to do his military service. So this is happening 1969. Vietnam is in full swing, and that in the draft is something that exists at the time. And really, literally anyone can be drafted at this point in time. Elvis was drafted, and like other prominent rich people could be drafted. I think we brought this up before. I'm not a proponent of the draft, but I do like to point out that when the draft was in effect, senators' sons did go to war. So going into Congress and voting for a war meant that your kids or your friends' kids could potentially be in that war. Whereas after, the draft was severed, now literally only poor people that they don't care about are going to go.
Yeah. Oh my God. It's so fucked up.
It's so fucked up. And so, when you're Congress, you want to fight a proxy war, they're like, yeah, let's do it, or whatever. So, or you want to fight a non-proxy war, I guess I should say. And they're like, yeah, let's do it,
Well,
so.
Yeah. I guess it is proxy to them. They don't feel that connection to these people,
You're so right. It's all proxy. Oh, shit. It's all proxy war. Oh, my God. Okay.
It's like they're playing they're playing Risk.
Yeah, with other people's kids, basically, and your own life. So, all right. So W needs to do his military service, though, primarily because the family has it's a family legacy. Both Prescott and Poppy have fairly, as they say, illustrative careers from the military, World War I and World War II, right? So W needs to carry this on. They're also wanting to put him into politics at some point in time, and this also at this period of time in America, there's the expectation that there would be some kind of service to country was still pretty high in terms of politicians, at least, even whether it was full military service or some other branch of government, right, or of service, like the National Guard, which is where we go here. So he's definitely not going to sign up for Vietnam. He definitely cannot risk the draft just to not go, right? Because I think at another time, somebody like W would have been just kind of like, I'm not going to go. I'm going to party. This is not right. All right, because he certainly did love to party. So, but at this point in time with him, he would wind up in Vietnam, and that just could not happen. So something else has to happen. So he needs to go to the National Guard. And the answer to this is the 147th National Guard Unit, which is in Ellington in Houston. And it's known locally as the Champagne Unit. All right.
What?
So, yeah, this gets fun. So, the thing is that there's already a list for people to get into the National Guard. Him wanting to go, of course, he's a Bush. He can skip the line. They're not trying to have that be on the record, even though that's the sort of thing everybody knows. But even just regular National Guard has a line. The Champagne Unit, the 147th, has an even longer line, right? And Bush baby Dubya still manages to jump it. So the Champagne Unit is known for what it does is it gives military service, protects rich boys from the draft. So it's the sons of billionaires and various businessmen. It also, this is interesting, it's also where the Dallas Cowboy players, like football players, go, right? Like,
What?
You don't want to lose your football player, right? So they go to this Champagne Unit. And so football players, they're not generally wealthy, or I don't think they were at the time. But at any rate, they were very valuable. They were the wealth makers. They were the talent for their very rich, like, team owners, in which, we won't get into this much, but sports teams have and ownership of sports teams have so much to do with politics. It's kind of staggering. That's just, I chose not to really get into it for this particular episode, but it is very interesting, the degree to which team ownership has to do with politicians. It's kind of fascinating. So the Dallas Cowboy players are there, and many of these guys actually were not pilots. And this is another funny thing, is that in the Champagne Unit, they made special positions for them. Things you wouldn't find in other National Guard units, because generally speaking, who goes to the National Guard, generally speaking, is people who have already served, and they either were combat pilots, or they did supply runs, right? They did backup work during their service in the military, flying planes, right? So most of them, generally speaking, are already pilots, and they enter the National Guard after their service, for the extra money, because you get paid. But I would kind of imagine also that, like, you want to fly, and probably, getting out of the military, you're not probably really going to be somebody who owns your own plane, so like going to the National Guard, right, would be a way that you would still get to fly. I mean, that's my imagination, but I would imagine that flying would be very addictive, and that you would really miss it when you didn't do it. That's what I would
true.
think. Right. So, but for these rich boys, they made up things for them, positions for them, so they could be in the National Guard without having to be pilots. But still, for W, he needed to be a pilot because he comes from a flying family, as we've talked about quite a bit. So it was just not really on the Bush family agenda for W to not be a pilot. So Poppy gets him into this thing, really. The family gets him into this Champagne Unit. And this is where who enters the picture is Jim Bath. Do you remember us?
Yes, I do.
Yes. So,
but maybe remind our listeners if you want to.
Yes, I will. So Jim Bath is someone who supposedly this is the first time he's introduced to the Bush family. And he goes on, though, from meeting W at the Champagne unit, he goes on to work as a contractor, basically, for Poppy Bush. And he runs several different front operations that launder money and cover up some other nefarious dealings, also with Saudi wealthy Saudi people. I won't say royals, but with the wealthy Saudis. One of them being Salem bin Laden. So Jim Bath, who is Osama bin Laden's brother, and Jim Bath becomes later on after this. He becomes a business manager for Salem bin Laden. But what Jim Bath can do is Salem bin Laden can, say, purchase an airplane from the United States, and Jim Bath can sign off on it. So Salem bin Laden's fingerprints are nowhere on it.
That's so crazy that that's where they met.
Yes.
Also, I just want to say there's like, I feel like people, when you're actually like serving in the military and like doing stuff, there's probably a lot of downtime because they just come up with some really evil plans.
Yeah,
because I'm just thinking about like in the Oklahoma City bombing, like we talked about how, you know, there is a timeline where he could have gotten mixed up in all that stuff starting in his time over in the Persian Gulf War. So they need to give them some books or some video games or something.
Something. Maybe they have it. Maybe they have that now. For sure. So Jim Bath later does all these businesses for George Bush. He is a business. I'm forgetting the name of it now, but there's a word for it.
Liaison?
A liaison, I think that's it, but where you can actually sign off. You have the power to like sign these documents.
Oh, okay.
He also does this for Khalid Mahfouz, who we had talked about before, also was in on the Promise software that was like that you could espionage enable. So they've been watching all these banks and terrorists and things all over the world. So anyway, Jim Bath later on is involved with all of these people in a very big way. Like he's not just mopping floors, all right? He's signing off on their purchases and contracts, all right? And also for George Bush. So anyway, and he's flying back and forth to Saudi Arabia during that period of time. But supposedly it's 1969 and he meets W for the first time in the Champagne unit, and the story goes like they just became buds like right away, and people found that they thought it was great, you know, W as a friend, but people also thought it was odd because apparently W was really known to only want to run in circles that had a comparable, like he was very socially conscious, and so he wanted to run with other rich kids, right? Like that was, you know, so he wasn't big on the going between the social classes. But Jim Bath, I guess, was an exception to this because Bath came from a fairly modest background, whatever that means. But he had also already like served his time. And so he had already served his time as a combat pilot, and he was known to be like what they called at the time, you call him a crackerjack, right? Right, when you're really good, they call you a crackerjack, right?
Oh.
I don't know if you remember that slogan. Yeah.
I don't know if I do, but I learn a lot, you know, making these episodes, so.
That used to be the slogan, the commercial that was on TV for Cracker Jacks, the candy, the popcorn. Yeah, so when you're really good, they call you Cracker Jack. So that was Jim Bath. So he was known to be like really one of the best, right? And he was in the Champagne unit ostensibly to earn money, and like I'm thinking probably so that he could continue to fly, supposedly. So, and he's a charming guy too, and they both like to party. But Jim Bath is a guy who really has what it takes, and he's already proven that. So while they strike up this friendship, what winds up happening is they party a little too much together, or I don't know. It gets dicey, as all things do. But what winds up happening? Yeah, right. So I think that here's what I'm about to get to. There's a good chance that Jim Bath was already acquainted with Poppy. They had been on the same lecture circuit. Poppy and Jim Bath had run around, to Republican conferences and schools and these different things. And they'd been on the circuit together giving these lectures and speeches as early as 1966. So did he meet him there? I don't know. But there's a good chance that Jim Bath was put in the Champagne unit to be W's minder from the beginning.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I actually was thinking, like, sure, I'm sure he does love to fly, but also if you're getting placed in that unit specifically, it seems like, okay, you're the Cracker Jack or whatever, so here's like a bunch of rich people you can network with and probably get an awesome job. Because that's all these little like weenie boys do anyways. They're just like, oh, your dad has a job at your company, my dad has a job at my company, let's trade companies and work for each other's dads. So, that's like, hey, you were great at your planes or whatever, take your pick of the rich kids. But yeah, if it was specifically also to be a setup with George Bush, that makes sense to me too.
Right, because I'm also thinking, here's the Champagne unit and like the Dallas cowboy players, the football players are like literally pushing paper around on a desk. Like that's not even what National Guard people do. If you're this pilot, why would you want to spend your time at the Champagne unit? Wouldn't you want to be around guys who had been in combat like you had been and who have skills like you would have?
Yeah,
I don't know.
He's over combat. Well, I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, he's like, I'm over combat. I want a job where I make a lot of money now. I'm good. I made my higher ups happy, so they gave me this gift of meeting all you rich kids.
Meeting all the rich kids, yeah. So very possibly Poppy put him in this position. So at any rate, Bath he's going up, he's flying with George, teaching George, training George. It's hard to say exactly what happened there. Well, actually, what they spent like $1 million to train George to fly in a unit that they had, I forget, I think it was in Georgia, and they, usually taxpayers' money is not spent to train National Guard pilots. But they spent all of this money to train Dubya to fly, and he actually became a second lieutenant, which even though he scored 25% on his flying test, and also these lieutenants usually have either 18 months of service, military service, or 4 years of ROTC, and he didn't have either one. So he's just like, none of this is real, right? But he had been trained to fly, but he obviously wasn't good at it. And so Bath was going up with him. They flew together all the time. They were like best friends and party buddies, and they flew together all the time. But something starts happening in 1971. So this is a couple years into the National Guard. This is shortly after, he's gotten all of this high level training, right? And all of a sudden Bush gets W gets cold feet or something, or vertigo or something. But what winds up happening is that he starts freaking out, and he can take a plane up, but the hardest thing to do in an airplane is to land it. And so he can't do it at all. He's locked up. And the story says that he couldn't even do it. And he couldn't even land a plane in a simulator. And a simulator, it's hooked to the ground. It's a box that you get in that's got robot legs on it. It mimics an airplane.
That's
right?
So weird.
Right. I was actually in a flight simulator once, and it was absolutely amazing. And you get turbulence and all this stuff. They're actually really cool. But well,
it's weird that he had this sudden mental change to flying.
Yes.
What the fuck happened?
Well, that's, we don't know for sure. But what does wind up happening is where anybody else would be grounded for this, or they would be, taken to therapy, or something else would happen with them. Instead, by 1972, he leaves Ellington Air Force Base, and he kind of goes to like hide away in Alabama at some I don't even know what, it doesn't really say, but somebody speculates he's reading manuals or whatever, but they're keeping him away from the sight of everyone so that nobody really comes to realize that W doesn't fly. He's not right. He's in the Air National Guard. He doesn't fly, But again, like the Champagne unit could have accommodated that for him, but the Bush family needs this prestige of him being a second lieutenant and of him being a flyboy. So
yeah, I mean, all
later,
of that really played into his like persona when he was running for president and stuff.
Yes, huge. It becomes really huge, and the lies that have to go into it get equally huge. So years later, there'll be a story concocted that he was suspended from flying because he missed his annual physical. And so what happens then is Jim Bath. Yeah, it's everybody around this. That is bullshit,
because it's like, if you're a rich person, you can go see a doctor at any time. So anyways, I don't need to speculate. Sorry. Yeah. Continue.
No, I mean, like, that's true. And so he even had this story of like, oh, well, it has to be this specific dot thing, blah, blah, blah. But everybody else in the National Guard was like, well, that's just not true. Oh. And, right? Like, you could, like, if you had really missed your physical, what would happen is you would have rescheduled it. Like you wouldn't have been like kicked out of the Guard for it. Like you wouldn't be suspended. You wouldn't be grounded for it. That's like not really a thing. And so they anticipated that. And so they had Jim Bath like kind of take a fall with him, which is also what makes me think he was more of W's minder than he was just a guy hanging out. Was because Jim Bath, you would think, would be very proud of his record. He wouldn't want to be grounded or suspended for anything. But he said, well, the same thing happened to me at the very same time. I, too, missed my physical, and I was also grounded because that happens all the time. And they kind of got away with this story for a while. Right? Right. So, because it made it seem routine. Like, well, that happens to guys all the time, and I mean, look at me, I'm Jim Bath, like, I'm the best, or whatever, I'm top notch.
Don't worry, it's totally normal. It happens to everybody sometimes.
Right. And like, as, there's a retired general named Flores who told, Russ Baker, who wrote Family of Secrets, I'm getting most of the information I'm telling you from, he said he'd never heard of anyone being grounded for that, much less two pilots at the same time from the same unit. He's like, yeah, no. And he went on to say that the amount of resources invested in Dubya and Bath, it defies reason that the punishment would be suspension, especially for Bath. But either way, it would be one, take it later, or two, Vietnam. That's what this guy said. He's like, Whoa. You're either going to take your physical or you're going to Vietnam. There's none of this like, oh, they just suspended me, right? So anyway,
that's so
crazy
weird.
Shit. Yeah, and there's procedures for all of this. I mean, this is the military. It's not like, things are not offhanded. Everything has a protocol. Everything has a chain of command. Everything is documented. So what Flores also said was that there would have been paperwork that he'd met with to do counsel with his commander, and then he would have met with the board, and all of those things would be recorded, and apparently they're not. So technically, what this means to the military is that you are actually AWOL from military service. So I'm going to read this from Bath. The future president and commander-in-chief had simply walked away from his National Guard duty during the Vietnam War. No amount of equivocation could get around that. Neither could an honorable discharge received in 1973 explain why the sole evidence that he had actually shown up anywhere after May 1972 was a machine-generated form listing dates and points earned. The fact was, his own officers had not seen him in Texas, and no credible documentation or witnesses emerged in Alabama, where he supposedly was.
Where were they?
Right? So nobody knows exactly what happened to W. So questions have been raised about this, I think, a little bit along the way, like where'd he go, what happened, but they really had it covered with this Jim Bath kind of nonsense. You know, we talked about this with Poppy. They're good at sort of like foreseeing, you know, something like that. And if Bath was the minder at the time that he walked away and went AWOL, you know, that's when Bath would have been brought in on the suspension story just to troubleshoot for the future. Like these are not stupid people, and they are experienced. We've talked about this before too. They're experienced in spycraft, in espionage. Like they know how to do these things, and at least according to Baker and some other people that I've read, you know, they say that these are not unusual or unique circumstances for people involved in spycraft. And so what to us seems like, well, now how could you foresee that? Well, why would you do that? None of that makes sense. Well, you know what? You're not a trained spy. You know,
checkmate, so, like, skeptics.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So what So all of this does come back, though, in 1994 and then again in 2000, because, of course, in 1994, W is going to run for governor, and then in 2000, he makes his first, run for president. So it does come back to him, and then everybody wonders, too, was it nerves or drugs? And because they were doing plenty of cocaine at the time, and even Bath's ex-wife had made allegations in their formal divorce proceedings, like it's in the paperwork, that cocaine use had affected Jim Bath's life and relationship. So that would have been during that time. And I believe, she was saying like it affected everything, affected our relationship, his work, everything. So I think there's pretty good evidence that
they were probably getting that good cocaine too.
Yeah, that they were hanging out, they were partying, and they were buds, and they were doing the blow, and this affected, like, everything. So,
I would not party with them. I just want to say, no. I would not party with them. Definitely not.
No, that would be horrible.
It would be
what
awful.
A horrible time. It would be totally
awful.
So, all right. So, but he, nonetheless, W is honorably discharged in 1973, even though nothing of his tenure in the National Guard makes any sense at all, or even seems to have a paper trail.
Well, okay.
Okay. So, but supposedly, if you believe that Jim Bath was just kind of there because he was there, what does happen, though, is maybe Poppy's so grateful that Jim took this dive, basically, in his own career for W, that Poppy repays him by bringing him in. Could be, we don't know. I tend to fall a little bit more on Jim Bath was waiting for W there. Like, hey, was a bit of a handler. I tend to fall on that side of it. But even if not, there's a good reason. Poppy is also known for showing his appreciation to people who do any favors for him, right? Poppy's real good at this stuff. Real good. And so it's also very possible that he was like, I just want to thank you for the rest of your life, Jim Bath, and we're bringing you in, to the fam, right? You're one of us now. And so...
God forbid you cross any of them.
Yeah, absolutely. But I don't think Bath ever does. Bath seems pretty contented, making this dough throughout his lifetime. So in 1977, though, Jim Bath purchased, on behalf of Osama Bin Laden, this is interesting. He purchases the Houston Gulf Airport, which is a small airport.
Okay.
Right. So it looks like it's owned by Jim Bath's front company, which is a real estate company. So that all makes sense, right? But it's actually owned by Osama Bin Laden's brother. All right. So this is from Baker also. Since the Federal Aviation Administration will certify only planes owned by Americans, Bath acted as the frontman for Saudi aviation purchases. In 1977, ostensibly on behalf of Osama bin Laden, Bath bought the Houston Gulf Airport, a small private facility in League City, Texas, 25 miles east of Houston. Bath also bought aircraft for bin Laden. Upon purchase, Bath immediately renovated the airport and extended and reinforced the runway to accommodate what he referred to as heavy iron, large corporate jets, and even light commercial aircraft. Bath bragged that Houston Gulf, unlike the city's other airports, had no U.S. Customs presence.
Oh my
God. Right? This absence of oversight could prove handy in many instances. Another property Bath bought as frontman for the Saudis was the Express Auto Park garage at Houston Hobby Airport. So that's a pretty big deal. So, like, he owns this garage at Houston Hobby. So even he can park, even if they are flying straight out of Houston Hobby, he can park their cars there. Nobody's going to know that they're there. Like, it's pretty incredible the way these things are fronted for them. So
that is really a lot. Yeah, for sure.
It's a lot. So Saudi funded cover for American intelligence.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. But it's like, why, when 9/11 happened, why was nobody talking about that?
Right.
Because that's just so crazy to me that, like, they're like, Osama Bin Laden, #1 enemy of the world. Mm-hmm. P.S. His brother owns an airport in Texas.
Right.
But we're just not going to talk about that.
I'm sure it doesn't have anything to do with anything. And, that's one that we know about. It doesn't mean that there aren't more. And there are other rich Saudis, whether they're, because the Bin Ladens, there's lots of Bin Ladens. They're a huge, family.
Right, they're a big family.
In Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Osama Bin Laden himself is one of 54 half siblings. So, it's the way they do it in Saudi Arabia. So the Bin Laden family is large, but they're also very, very wealthy. We were kind of sold this image of Osama Bin Laden, like he's this crazy caveman, and maybe he kind of became that in Afghanistan. We'll get to that a little bit later, but that's not what he comes from. Like, he was a very pampered, wealthy son in Saudi Arabia. So also that airport that's purchased in 1977, it comes into play during Iran-Contras too, which is part of the Reagan White House. We haven't talked a lot about Iran-Contras. Maybe someday we will. But at any rate, that's guns for drugs, proxy war. Mm-hmm. I think most people know a little bit something about that. But this airport came into effect for that event also. So Bath was the vehicle through which Osama Bin Laden's brother owned a CIA-connected airline. That's what happens. I mean, that's just wild. I mean, you're right. And that's happening in 1977, at the time that Poppy Bush is officially the head of the CIA for a hot minute, right? Mm-hmm. And that's official. That's on paper. So that's what's happening. That's what's happening now. At that point in time. So, all right. So the National Guard problem comes up again in 1994 when W is running for the governor of Texas. This is interesting because this shows how they roll. It shows how this family rolls. So an Austin reporter digs all this up. We're in 1994 now, and an Austin reporter asked W, as he's running for governor, he asks him how he managed to get into the 147th, because it's a good question. This guy's like, so how did you didn't have any of the stuff you needed to get in there. How did you do that? And, he answers it simply by saying, it wasn't favoritism. I honorably served, and that's that. And then nobody asked any follow-up questions, right? So it seems like that's over. It's dead in the water. That's his answer. I honorably served. There's no problem. Let's carry on, right? Mm-hmm. But the moment the debate ends, the communication manager comes, and this is a guy named Moore. And so this is intense. And so this communications manager approaches this. Moore is the reporter. And so the communications manager from Dubya's campaign gets a hold of this reporter after he dares to ask this question, right? So it's Karen Hughes is the woman who she figures in prominently to a lot of things. So Karen just makes a beeline for me and gets in my face and tries to separate me from the crowd, Moore said. Then she starts a rant. What kind of question is that? What did you ask that? Why did you ask that question? Who do you think you are? That's just not relevant to being governor of Texas. He's not trying to run the federal government. He's going to run the state of Texas. What does his service in the National Guard have to do with anything? He doesn't have an army to run here in Texas. Why would you ask such a question, Jim? Right?
Okay.
That's how they do you.
Defensive.
Right. And so in response, he says to her, it's about character, Karen. It's about his generation and mine coming of age and how we dealt with what we all viewed as a bad war. Mm-hmm. As the reporter was turning to go file his story, Bush's chief strategist, here's where things get super fun, Karl Rove, right?
Oh, here he comes,
and so Karl Rove gets a hold of him too and says, what was that question, Moore? And I said, well, you know what it was, Karl. I said, it's a fair question. And he said, it wasn't fair. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. And his rant was less energized than Karen, but it was the same thing, trying to say, you're stupid. You're a yokel local, and you're stupid, and you don't know what you're doing. Whoa. Bush's handlers thought they could get reporters off a story by intimidating them, and often they turned out to be right. I think it's so important where Moore says, he's trying to tell me I'm stupid. I think that the gaslighting in that, especially since nobody asked any other questions, like he wasn't backed up by his own reporters, and you got these two people coming at you, separating you from the crowd, basically in your face, even people who know they're really good at their job, when you're put in a situation where kind of what you expect and what seems reasonable to you is brought into question by everyone around you, and the other reporters are bringing it into question by not following up, by having no curiosity about it, right? So you could really doubt yourself, and this guy knew that. He's saying, here's what they were saying to me. Here's where the intimidation is coming in. I'm supposed to second guess myself, but I don't think this guy ever really did. So it's so much bullying and just, tricking them would be another thing that they would do. They would trick journalists with info dumps, which this is kind of an interesting, if a reporter asks for something, they would just give them boxes and boxes of information, right? And sometimes, double and triple of the same documents so that you just have so much paperwork. You just have so much paper. You just have so many things to look through. Yeah. And it's that's a good one. I read a story about a guy who used that with the FBI. The FBI was trying to intimidate him, and they would just call him every few weeks and ask him for another document, just to remind him that they're still watching him or whatever, to just scare him. And so finally, this went on for a year and a half or something. Finally, one day he's I sent him everything in my house. I sent him my high school yearbooks. I sent him every letter. I sent him every piece of paper in my house. And I never heard from him again. Because then he could just be oh, I've got it. It's in your box. You've got it or whatever. So info dumps can work for regular people. But that's what I traveled in this when I was touring many years ago. Late 90s, we were in this rig that just this truck and this camper that was very clearly not road safe. And so we would get pulled over pretty often. And Yeah, well, the guy who owned the whole setup or whatever, he had this down and he was so calm and relaxed. It was one of the most amazing things I ever saw, and he would lean over to the glove box and he would pull out this stack of papers and he'd just be like, well, and he would start handing the cop all these things and explaining all this stuff. And like, I saw him do it twice. I know he did it more than that, but I saw it twice. And both times the cop was like, oh, well, okay. Well, all right. Well, all right. Here you go. And just handed it back and let us go, because it was just like he sounded like he knew what he was talking about, and the cop was like, I'm not gonna go. I'm not gonna try to figure this out. This is too much for me. So
I don't want to read all this. I don't want to report that I read all this.
Yes, honestly. So there you go, folks. Don't say you don't get tips here on Secret Antenna. They would also stonewall and exile journalists who asked hard to answer questions. I mean, and that definitely runs through to this day, that I think at another point in history, reporters, you could go ask the White House questions. They'd have these press conferences that were open to reporters. I'm sure you had to have some certain credentials, but if you worked for the paper, you could get in there and ask whatever questions you want. But these days, and this has been going on for a long time, you've got to be on their list to get into the press conference. So if the White House knows you're hostile to them, you don't get into their press conferences, which right there, people, that, what does that sound like as an American person? Like, our reporters, we can only have friendly reporters asking the White House questions. Does that sound like a free press? Does that sound, right? So, but anyway, they would stonewall journalists and, just run all these things. So, and basic just covert operations of disinformation, which we know they're really good at. So, you serve up some disinformation to a reporter who then reports on it, and then it comes back and and it's like, well, that's not even right. You just ruined that reporter, right? They're ruined. Which is the story that we're going to get to now. We're skipping way ahead. He's been governor. He's been president for one term at this point. And so we're in 2004, but I'm still talking about the journalism thing. So in 2004, when he was campaigning for re-election, Mary Mapes, who was a producer at CBS, and she was kind of up and coming because she had, or pretty well established, I guess, because she had initially broke the story about prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib, even though at the time CBS didn't publish it yet because they just had cold feet on it, I guess. But then when they heard the New York Times was going to go forward, then CBS published it. So even though she technically broke the story, it was, I think, Seymour Hersh who got the real accolades on it. But at any rate, I know, right? So, but at any rate, she was the one who had broke that story. And she was on to this fake military service of W also, because it shows so much. It's not just a draft dodge. It's not, it really is this very in-depth. You have a fake pilot from, this family who's just throwing, he's a second lieutenant. Like, he didn't earn any of that. So, this story is actually really a big deal, especially for a president who now is, as Karen Hughes had said before, she said, well, he's leading Texas, he's not the commander in chief. Well, now he is. Right? And he's the commander in chief who's in the middle of a war.
Right.
And so Mary
started a war. Continuing a war, yeah. Yeah.
So she goes after the military service of W, and what happens becomes known as Memo-gate, or also Rathergate, which I don't know if you even remember. Do you know who Dan Rather is? Do you remember Dan Rather?
Yes.
Okay,
absolutely.
All right. Because, cool, because I kind of have forgot about Dan Rather, but, I really grew up with, Dan Rather's, voice in the background of my life. Dan Rather was highly respected.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess, journalist anchor on 60 Minutes, which used to also be a very highly respected journalist show. So, but anyway, this is actually what ruined him, and I had kind of forgotten this story. But what they did is the Bush family, they're so crazy. They made fake documents that confirm what the journalists had known for years. So this guy named Bill Burkett is like he's a fake, he's a plant, he's a mole, but he's faking like I'm a source, right? And so he's leading these journalists on, these high level at the time respected journalists, and he's leading them on. He's like, now I have these documents, and it has to do with the subject of the guard service, and the documents confirm what all of these reporters suspect, right? And so finally, he turns them over to Mary Mapes, who faxes them off, and she even says, like, I want to do more on this before we release them. I want to look into this more. But her news source goes ahead and puts it out. Mary Mapes, I'm so sorry that she had to work for CBS, because they must be awful. Because they screwed her a lot. So let me read this paragraph from Baker. So what happened next morphed into an epic scandal that would soon overwhelm questions about Bush and influence media coverage for the rest of the election. There would be many casualties. CBS anchorman Rather, producer Mapes, and 3 other CBS staffers were fired or dismissed. Bill Burkett would become a pariah, and his life would collapse around him. As such, he became yet another in a long line of people who had stood up to the Bushes and suffered the consequences. I'm sorry, Bill Burkett was not the mole. He was, I guess he was the reporter who brought the story in, and Mapes broke it. So anyway, but at this point in time, this is what winds up, because Dan Rather reported it. And so it absolutely ruined Dan Rather's career. And I just find that, right? Absolutely amazing.
Wait,
and
so what year was this? Do you remember?
This was 2004.
Okay.
And so the Bush family had made these fake documents, had set up this whole sting, basically, I guess is what you want to call it. CBS reports on it, or whoever's running, that news outlet, network news outlet reports on it. And then the Bush family comes back with, well, those documents are fake. And it's then proved that the documents were indeed fake, even though they contained all of the information that we know to be most likely is true about George W. Bush. You see how sneaky this is?
Yeah,
and then they ruin.
I mean, honestly, it's a bold plan. First of all, it's very dangling it in front of their faces just to only take it away. So it's like a cat playing with its mouse that it's about to eat or whatever, Yeah,
it is, and it sends such a message to everyone. They're like, well, if we can do it to Dan Rather, what do you think we're going to do to you? You know what I mean?
God.
Right. And the
news really sucks nowadays. Like, the news fucking blows.
It does. It really sucks. And these are reasons why it really sucks. Like, all these reporters going down because the Bush family, strategically took them down. And, not being able, only friendly people can get invited to these press conferences, friendly journalists, So, of course our news really sucks. And I think, it was just, I looked this up today, too. I think there was even a judge, just let Rachel Maddow off for something. It wasn't defamation because her audience expects her to use hyperbole.
Right. It was her and Tucker Carlson got let off of stuff like that because they argue that their show wasn't news.
Right. Her audience expects her to not, they get it that it's not it's hyperbole. I guess is the way.
Insane.
It's insane. And I'm like, how does that work like that? So anyway, but this is kind of the reason why it does work like that, So anyway, that's that. So there was another writer who was an authorized biographer of Bush, of Dubya, And he had Mickey Herkowitz, and he was writing a book about Dubya that was authorized. And he had, and he was friendly. He loved the Bush family. He'd done other work for them. So this was all on the level. But what had happened was, in some of he turned in his first 10 chapters, and in it, George W. Bush had actually admitted to Herkowitz, well, I never flew again. Like, after he got that cold feet in 71, like, he said it himself. I never flew again, military or, commercial, right? Herkowitz didn't think anything of it, and he just put it in the book. And then another thing that Bush's people were angry about is that Herkowitz had characterized the oil businesses as floundering, which was true. And anybody in politics or business knew that W's oil companies were floundering. They were failures and or fronts, however you wanted to look at that. So Herkowitz, again, didn't think that was something he couldn't say, but they didn't like that. And so what happened was they confiscated all of his work. They confiscated the 10 chapters, yanked the book away from him, gave him a warning, right? And then about continuing forward. But they wanted everything he had, and then plus to delete, scrap, get rid of whatever he might have laying around, so there wouldn't be any evidence. And then Karen Hughes, who went after that other reporter, right? Who do you think you are? Uh-huh. She wrote the book. She put it. And so, yeah. Wow. And so then too, I know, right? And what's funny is here you have Poppy then doing his Poppy thing. And he's like, hey, Mickey, listen, I know it's a disappointing time. I'll tell you what, why don't you write a book about my father, Prescott, which Herkowitz did. So, like, that's how Poppy comes in, where he's like, hey, look, man, no hard feelings, right? Right? This is what Poppy's super good at. Whereas Bush can be, charming over some cocktails and, kind of down home like Texan. Poppy Bush is like, he's real good with the, with the thank you notes, so to speak.
Okay.
Right? So, however you want to put that. So, all right. Well, at any rate, I am going to. That's how they handle the press. So obviously, the Bush family has the press in their pocket, and they have for a long time. It just really, by 2004, there was no stopping them. They had really shut down any press that anyone was going to do on them, including later on this biography about W. That was shut down also. And he was out of office by then.
Wow.
So they're still controlling this. All right, so we're going to talk about Saddam Hussein a little bit. And
enter Saddam. Stage left.
Right, and so we're going to back up to Poppy's White House a little bit, just because, like, here's the thing, and this is just winds up being really the truth. Poppy, George H.W. Bush, really, from what I can tell, ran the White House for no less than 20 years, maybe more. So he ran it as vice president in the Reagan administration, then he had it his own for 4 years, and then he really ran W's White House. Like I said, W is extraordinarily unmotivated, and he seems to be disinterested in many things. He'll serve at some point in time. He serves, we'll talk about the Carlyle Group too, but he serves 3 years on the board of the Carlyle Group, which is an investment bank that's a big deal between the Bushes and the Saudis, right? And even the guy who runs that, eventually after 3 years, he's like, you're not interested. Like, I don't know why you're here. And W's like, you're right. I'm leaving. I don't like this business. I don't like being, and it's just like, that's like everything he's done in his life. If it wasn't like a kegger or being very charming with other charming people, I don't think he really cared about it. I think he liked to party. He liked to socialize. I think there was a chance he enjoyed being an orator. I think he perhaps liked being a public politician, having that attention. But when it came to any kind of work, like I don't, he didn't care about flying planes. He didn't care about serving on the board of an investment. I don't think he cared about being president. Like, he just didn't care. So, anyway, not stupid, unmotivated.
I mean, I fucking relate to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, true, and and I really do. In looking at him and thinking about the situation with the death of his sister, I honestly am like, I don't know. I mean, because like his parents are not addicts, like like they didn't. That's not what they do. They're not unmotivated. Like I just kind of feel like that says something. Like that incident in his childhood has something to do with like kind of how he was like, fuck it. I don't know. Just
I hate feeling bad for him.
Right? I know. But you've heard me say this before about him. Out of everybody in the W family or in the Bush family, I think W was the one that would like sometimes, had that like, damn, that's cold-blooded. But that doesn't mean he gave a fuck. It just means that I think he actually noticed. Like, I feel like Poppy Bush had all of this. Like, Poppy was like, these are the reasons why what we do is right and good for the world. And I think W was a little, again, just my personal opinion. W was a little bit more like, well, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, I guess, but come on, that's pretty cold-blooded, right? Yeah. So, all right, so we're backing up to Poppy's White House a little bit, one of them anyway. And so throughout the Reagan-Poppy Bush years, the White House had been an eager backer of Saddam. The two administrations had provided millions of dollars in aid and had permitted the export of U.S. technology that Iraq used to build a massive arsenal of chemical, biological, and possibly nuclear weapons. So this, right, I know. And so in a paradoxical twist, when W sought to justify the invasion of Iraq in 2003, he cited those same weapons without mentioning that his own father had helped to provide them. He also failed to mention what many proliferation experts correctly believed, that most or all of those weapons had been destroyed as part of Saddam's scale down after the imposition of the no-fly zones and President Clinton's own threats to invade. So, all of this is important, leading up to this place. So when W is out on the world saying, well, we got to go in, they have weapons of mass destruction, he's talking about something in the past that his father was part of. I find that a fascinating.
He's like, we know they have them because we got them for them. Yep.
All right. So, that happens. I mean, that's the lead up to like, we need to attack Saddam, that starts early. That starts before W really gets in office. But the 2000 election, as itself is widely considered stolen. God, I remember Gore's concession. It was so pathetic. But, right, I remember it really well. And I even remember Democrats in my life who I knew personally who were like mad about the recounts. Like, just because they thought it looked bad. They thought Gore should have some dignity and concede. And that's really what was in the media at the time, right? This very, like, controlled media was even kind of promoting that idea that Gore was just making himself look foolish. He was looking like a sore loser. And, I remember it very well because I was like, what? Like, one of the things I always said was like, that the right would never do that, right? They would fight tooth and nail. Well, and I mean, do I wind up being prescient on that?
Yeah. I think you do.
Right? So, like, they wouldn't give up. But his own people, his own voters, really thought he should give up. So there's that. The hanging Chads spectacle, I'll never forget that. I think of the hanging Chads every once in a while. Do you remember that?
No, what's the hanging Chads?
You used to be, you go in and you voted. You would stick this little needle through through a card in this kind of contraption, right? So you had this little needle that you voted with, and it would knock a hole out of where you voted for somebody. And so they were trying to recount, looking at these cards. They were trying to go through these recounts.
Right.
And there were,
okay.
right?
I remember this now.
And some of them were like, well, no, look, they voted for Bush, but there's a hanging Chad. And the Chad was the little piece of paper that didn't pop all the way out.
Right.
Right? And God, I can remember just laughing my ass off at, like, what a ridiculous spectacle it all was. And every once in a while, that'll go through my mind. I'm like, damn hanging Chad. Whatever.
Yeah, that's so wild.
Right. So someone else who was already a big player on the global terrorism scene was Osama Bin Laden, of course. They already knew about Osama Bin Laden. I mean, during the 90s, they knew about Osama Bin Laden. And as I say, they're one of the richest families in Saudi Arabia. But what's happening now, this was 1984, so by the time like Bush is getting into the White House, Osama bin Laden's pretty powerful at this point in time. And he's been talked about all through the 90s, his various terrorist activities, right? So, but in 1984, Osama founded Maktab al-Khidmat with Abdullah Yusuf Azam, who was a Palestinian man who was also an Islamic scholar and a theologian, known sometimes, Abdullah Yusuf Azam is sometimes known as the father of global terrorism, all right? So father of global terrorism, and he and Osama bin Laden found this thing that goes by the MAC, all right? So Abdullah Yusuf Azam he's a jihadist, which is, for anybody who doesn't know, jihad means it's a struggle against, in this case, a struggle against the enemies of Islam. But it can also be a struggle against the self, against sin, or simply struggle. So jihad can have a few meanings. But in this particular sense, it means the struggle against the enemies of Islam. And that was this guy, and he and Osama started the MAC, which is the precursor to Al-Qaeda. And its mission was to recruit foreign volunteers for the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And so they end up being in alignment with the Mujahideen, which are the guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan who are fighting against Soviet rule in Afghanistan in the 80s, which the United States is funding a large part of the Mujahideen. Okay, so like the U.S. is already in this thing. And then there is Osama bin Laden and the MAC, right, which is they're fighting also against the Soviets, right? So that's where these two things really start to line up. But I want to be, clear, like what the United States has in common, because this is a proxy war too, all right? And this is their proxy war against the Soviets because the Cold War is still happening in the 80s. And so the United States is funding this, and they're in alignment at this point with Osama bin Laden. So this is how all of this, when it comes to money and it comes to alignments and companies and politics and wars, all of these things, what leads up to a final attack on the trade towers in 2001 is convoluted. Like it's a very complicated web that does not have a straight line, because at this point in time, the United States is not going to have any problem if they find out that money's going to Osama bin Laden. And we also don't know that they're not really directly funding that. We know the Saudis are, because Osama bin Laden is a Saudi. And the Saudis are also against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And so are many of the Afghani people. Like the Soviet, it's an occupation. Like that's not, right? So some Afghanis like that government, and some of them don't. But at any rate, it was imposed on the people of Afghanistan. So these kinds of alignments have a way of spiraling out of control, which is later what Bhutto, the prime minister of Pakistan, winds up saying. Is she's like, it's gone too far. To the United States, she had said, it's gone too far. Like, you have to pull it back. Like, yes, they've had your interest in mind now for a long time. You've had this alignment, at least against the Soviets, but you don't, like, the U.S. is not aligned with Islamic fundamentalism, right? Is it? So the U.S. had been warned a long time ago. Like, you need to pull back the reins on this. You need to stop funding these things. But they didn't. So the MAC winds up being linked to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, which is enough evidence right there against Osama bin Laden. But by this time, like I say, during the 90s, he's the most known terrorist in the entire world, and a lot of people fear what Osama bin Laden and the MAC at that time is going to do. So this attack on the World Trade Center, among many around the world, immediately connect bin Laden to the eventual final attack on the trade towers. And because of bin Laden's wealthy background, he was sometimes called the Gucci terrorist, which is yeah, they called him the Gucci terrorist. The CIA, the Bushes, the Mujahideen were guerrilla forces on the ground in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden had the common goal to defeat the Soviets. So the MAC is the precursor to Al-Qaeda, and its mission was to recruit foreign volunteers for the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And so you have the CIA, which is the Bush family. You have the Mujahideen, which is the guerrilla forces, and they're all in Afghanistan, and they are united at this point in time during the 80s. And what really changes things, because this has been a long war against the Soviet occupation, and so against the Soviet government. So what happens at the end of the 80s is Ronald Reagan sends these guys, these guerrilla fighters, which probably includes some of these people of the MAC. And, you got to think about it, like on the ground, like if you and I might be the Mujahideen and like I'm getting money from the US and you're the MAC and you're not, but I've got stuff that you can use to fight our common goal. I'm going to provide those things to you, right? You know what I'm saying? So like, even if they weren't intentionally providing money to the MAC, they were just by virtue of how things actually work on the ground, right? So one of the things that they got, this is so crazy to me, but they got these things called Stinger missiles, which is a backpack that shoots a missile that can take down like $1 million planes right out of the sky. And so this changes the whole game. This actually winds up being what ends the Cold War in some ways, because what happened at that point was it became much too expensive for the Soviets to continue to fight in Afghanistan. And so because these guys, they could put on this backpack with this missile, like it wasn't huge equipment, and the U.S. was giving it to them. Whoa. So the Reagan White House, right? Bobby Bush, right? So anyway, against their common enemies, So anyway, that's basically how that war ended, from what I can tell. Is one of the or how how the Afghani people and the freedom fighters and the MAC and the CIA, won the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan is the Stinger missile. And so, at that point, the Soviets are like, yeah, we can't do that. I can't send, how many $1 million planes can you send? Anyway, I think that's interesting. But also, I don't know, also quite a way to, can you imagine getting that, being a guerrilla fighter, and all of a sudden you're like, holy shit!
I have this giant missile! Yeah, that would be crazy.
Yeah, it'd be crazy. So anyway, that winds up kind of leading to this, ending the Cold War in some ways, which I know in the past I'd said, Poppy kind of inherited that that moment in 1989 when the Cold War ended. But then as I do more research on it, I'm like, well, maybe that's not the right way to say it. Maybe he did. Maybe he did.
Maybe he timed it because he wanted credit for his secret mission.
I mean, you might not be wrong about that. They're pretty good at that kind of shit, right? So, so this is still pre-Al-Qaeda, and I'm going to read a little bit from Craig Unger's book, House of Bush, House of Saud, which is a crazy book, which is also part of why, it's hard to keep on the timeline. I have to jump around with topics because of, it's so dense and intense what happens in this story. So this is from Unger, and he says, not long after Poppy took office in 1989, Poppy was warned about exactly this possibility by someone in a position to know, and that's that there would be an attack. Displeased that the president continued to support extremist radical Muslims, Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto let him know about the dangers. Arming the Mujahideen might initially have been the right thing, she told Bush, but she explained that extremists so emboldened by the United States during the 80s are now exporting their terrorism to other parts of the world to the extent that they use heroin trafficking to pay for their exploits. So this is a big part of what's happening now. One of the reasons that the Taliban was able to rise to power, and it's not that the Taliban doesn't use heroin export from Afghanistan to support themselves. It's not that they're not drug dealers. I'm not saying that. But at one point in time, Afghanistan had been the producers of 40% of the world's heroin supply, which there's legitimate uses of heroin also. So it's not just illicit, drug use. Hospitals and things use it. So they were producing 40%. Once the, Americans and Soviets were in there, it went up to 90%, and it was destroying.
What?
Yes, and heroin use and drug dealing and all of these things were absolutely tearing Afghanistan apart. And so one of the ways that the Taliban was able to rise is that they were ones that had the power and the might to turn that around and bring the heroin production down. And anyway, it all goes back to the 80s. What's happening right now is rooted, probably before that. But at any rate, none of this is happening without these outside influences, these very wealthy outside influences, in particular the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, have a big hand in all of these things that are going on. At a certain point also in this game, the Saudi Arabia strips Osama Bin Laden of his citizenship, which happens in, I think, the early 90s, and they start to dissociate from Osama Bin Laden. Some of the things that get said about Osama Bin Laden is that his experiences in Afghanistan, because I have to continuously remind myself and everyone else, he is Saudi Arabian. He is Saudi Arabian wealth. He's the Gucci terrorist from somewhere else. It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
But, right. But everybody kind of says this, it seems like, about Osama Bin Laden. He had been deeply radicalized by his experiences with the Soviets and who apparently were very brutal in Afghanistan. And no doubt also from his buddy that he ran the MAC with, who was an Islamic fundamentalist, a straight-up jihadist. So I'm sure that those two things together changed who Osama bin Laden was. By all accounts, people say that's true, from people who fought with him to his family in Saudi Arabia. But his family in Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of them. You got 54 kids. You're like, I'm cutting that one loose, I guess, or whatever. I'm good. Because they did disown him, and they disowned him prior to the first bombing of the World Trade Center in '93. So this is also from Carl Unger, and it says, the Clinton administration realized that bin Laden had radically redefined the way terrorism worked. He was not just underwriting bombings, he was also running huge training camps for terrorists and had to set up a network to finance them. With his Al-Qaeda operatives, he could ship massive quantities of arms across international borders and use suicide bombers to engage in sophisticated feats of asymmetrical warfare. He was even trying to obtain materials for nuclear weapons and to develop chemical arms. Moreover, he and his network embodied a new transnational entity, an Islamic fundamentalist army that was state-free. With bin Laden in the saddle, no longer were terrorists dependent on state sponsors. In Sudan and later in Afghanistan, it was he who helped out the government financially, not the other way around.
Oh.
Right.
Whoa.
I know. So bin Laden specifically, and Al-Qaeda in general, marks the first time in world history that there has been a terrorist organization that was free-floating, that was absolutely sovereign from any other nation. So
autonomous zone.
Yeah. Oh my God. It is. It's a polo. It's
Holy
a terrorist
shit.
polo.
It can be done.
Well, I mean, that's definitely what bin Laden said about it. So, yeah, I guess we'll leave you with that for this portion of the Bush saga. Thank you, everyone, for putting up with me. There's
oh my
so
God,
much more
no.
to tell you.
Thank you. I love, like, I mean, it's really like the details are what they're trying to, like, keep away from people. So it is really interesting to, like, have all these details laid out and put together about George Bush specifically, like W specifically, because they really don't want you to put these pieces together. But Michelle, you're doing it. And just because you're jumping around, I mean, they're not making it easy for anybody. So get it where you can.
No, and I mean, they're not. And they're trying to cover the details and also the context. Like, I try to contextualize some of these, like, where some of the conclusions are coming from, because they are potential conclusions, because they sound unrealistic unless you know how they operate, and then you're like, oh, that sounds like that sounds like something they would do. So yes, details and context are really everything in this story. So yes, thank you. Bye, Kelly.
Okay, thanks for everything.
I'll tell you the rest next time. All right,
can't
bye.
wait. Bye.